UDL is not about making work easier or lowering standards. Text-to-speech leveled the playing field in John Mundorf's classroom.
After learning about universal design the first summer, I came back to my classroom, and after I felt really comfortable about the 3 principles of universal design, I wanted to start with something really specific. And that year I had a student in my classroom who previously in school attended school frequently, so he wasn't an attendance problem, not a behavior problem at all, an engaged student that wanted to learn. But this student really struggled with reading, and it ends up that he's profoundly dyslexic, and came into my classroom and excited about starting the new school year, but really down though about his ability to read. And so we talked and got to know each other, and I looked at his records, and we kind of established that this is probably what was going on. And so we talked a little bit about this idea of dyslexia, and he said, well, what's dyslexia? And so I'm sure at some point someone might have mentioned it to him along the way, but here's this boy that thought that he just wasn't good at school when it's something totally beyond his control. So what I found though was that his schooling up to that point, while the teachers had well-intentioned and gave him a lot of different experiences, it still was very text focused in a traditional sense. So as students were reading books on level, he was still reading books at a much lower level to help him with that decoding. And not that that's not important, but he was missing out on really rich content. And what I found when he came into my classroom was he was lacking a lot of background knowledge on topics, especially in math, science, and social studies. And so my first attempt to provide multiple means of representations to my students came through the idea of using text-to-speech. I wanted to take the text, the traditional text, and I wanted to find it in a digital format. And so I contacted our district office, and I asked the folks in assistive technology. I contacted the heads of the departments, and I found that all of our textbooks all had digital versions that I could access. And then I also found out that our school district had a text-to-speech program on the computers that was a universal program on every computer, but people didn't know about it. So I learned more about using that, and I learned about the digital materials. And so that meant that when we were in a science or a social studies class or a math class, that the student was able to participate without a full-time inclusion teacher sitting by his side reading everything to him. So we'd be in a science class, and we'd be working on lesson 1 and gathering content and reading, and he'd go back to the computer and he would listen, and he would then come back and be able to participate in the group. But then a really interesting thing happened was that kids started to say, well, what's going on? Why is he going to the computer? And so then I said, well, this is the program that's being used. It's an electronic book, and then we also have this text-to-speech program. And so then some other kids, well, can I try it? And sure, you can try it. And then what I found, it wasn't just the kids that had struggled with reading. It might have been a student that, wanted to read more, wanted to read at a higher level, already understood the content we were learning about in class, but wanted to do something, more enriched or advanced. So, would go to National Geographic's website, which is written at a much higher level than a 4th grade level, but using the text-to-speech, he would listen and be able to understand it. And so what I found was, in making the accommodation for the student in the margins, the student that had been left behind, all of my other students benefited as a result. So it wasn't just an individual accommodation, a specific assistive technology accommodation, although it started as that. It grew though into a universal design idea of everybody has access to it, and people are going to use it for different reasons, whether it be they want to read something more challenging, they're having a hard time reading the text, maybe they just prefer to read on the computer, maybe they like the note-taking options in the digital version as opposed to paper and pencil. It doesn't matter. The point was though, they had the option, and they were able to make that choice. And then once people started making choices, we would talk about, well, why did you make that choice? Was that a good choice for you? But what happened though was it allowed everybody to participate. There was no lowering of standards. This boy was doing on grade level work with us, and I wasn't assessing his ability to decode the words on the page, so I didn't want that to get in the way of him learning science or social studies or math. And it was funny because there was a day where Because of that, though, he now had access. He had this learned behavior of, well, I can just say I don't know how to read it and then I can get out of doing it. Well, he didn't have that option anymore. And so there was a great moment where we play a review game in my class. We play a review basketball game. So when we learn about math, when we're getting ready for a test, we'll play just a basketball game where we ask questions and they get it right, they shoot a basket. And so this boy came in and he hadn't completed his work to be able to play the game. And he played the card of why I couldn't read it. I said, well, you have this tool here, you have this tool here, you made a bad choice. So it was no longer an academic problem, it was a behavioral problem. So the vision in my head that I'll never forget was, we're getting ready to play the game, and here's this boy who forever would have been allowed to play because he just said, I can't read it, had to walk back to the computer, flip open the scanner, put down his book, and do the work back there, just grumping along. And he wasn't happy about it, probably not a highlight in his life, but for me, I realized he's being treated like every other fourth grader at this point. He's not being singled out because of his dyslexia or his struggles with reading. He's now being treated like everybody else, and that's the whole point. You know, universal design for learning doesn't mean everybody gets straight A's. It means that everybody has access and opportunity to get those good grades or those good marks and to learn. But it doesn't mean that everybody passes with flying colors. It's not a lowering of standards. It's not making school easier for people. It's providing access to appropriate goals and standards for each and every student.